Welcome back to Train Signal's Citrix XenApp training. You're watching Configuring Printing lesson. Arguably the most controversial topic with XenApp is printing. Whenever you mention the word Citrix back in the day, people automatically associated that with printing. And it's not because Citrix didn't know how to configure printing properly or the software wasn't mature enough to handle printing. It's because of the complexity and the nature of printing in a server-based computing model, especially when you have devices and printers that are in different geographical locations than where the XenApp servers are. However, printing in XenApp and presentation server in general has come an extremely long way. It is significantly more stable. It is significantly better. So in this lesson, what I'm going to try to do is condense all my knowledge, everything that I've learned over the years from a printing perspective, and see if we can make sense out of printing. But what I want to start with first is talk about, well, how does Windows handle printing, right? So how does the job or the print job travel between the client and how does it come out? When it comes out of the printer, how does the output happen? We just want to lay out the groundwork. This is stuff that you probably know. I just want to do a quick refresher so that it would be a nice cutover into the actual topics that we're going to talk about. Then we're going to talk about, common printing terminology. What does a print queue mean? What does a print job mean? Etc. etc. We're going to go in and talk about the different types of printers and print job routing methods that exist with XenApp. So there's a lot of different ways by which you can route a print job using XenApp, and depending on the scenario and the situation, you might want to have print jobs print through the print spooler or the print server itself, and in some instances you might not want to do that. So again, depending on the circumstance, we're going to discuss that and see where it makes sense and where it doesn't. Installing and replicating print drivers is another thing that we want to discuss with XenApp in particular. When a user establishes a session with a XenApp server, you want to be able to have their printers show up within that session. Those printers are going to require that drivers for the print devices that are being automatically created within the session that are coming from the client side. You want to make sure you have drivers for these devices, otherwise they wouldn't map within the session. I'm summarizing here, but I'm just trying to give you an example or an understanding of what it means for installing the printers. And by the same token, we need a way of replicating these print drivers, so that's what we're going to talk about. Then we're going to talk about printing policies. What can you configure within the Citrix policies as it relates to printers? If you remember, we skipped over that section within the policies. We're going to talk about how you can use the ICA client print configuration tool, how you can publish that to your users and give them a little more control over how they can configure certain aspects of printers within the session. So if they don't see the printer they need, maybe they can use the ICA client printer configuration tool and configure a printer or configure certain aspects of the printer. And we're going to talk about mobile users and printing. This is going to be one of the most interesting topics of the lesson is, well, if user has an iPad and they're traveling across the campus and all of a sudden they're on the 56th floor and their printer is on the 2nd floor, but there's another printer close by, how do they get access to that printer automatically in some form of proximity printing? I think that's going to be a lot of fun. All right, so how does Windows printing work, right? So the first thing that happens is you'll notice here you have the user and a workstation. This user is going to initiate a connection to the print server. This is our print server. The client is going to initiate this connection. The second thing that happens, the print job is going to spool at the print server. This is what the client wants to print. So this job is now going to spool. The second thing that's going to happen is it's going to add the print job to the queue. And the queue is just like a holding place, right, where print jobs go to get processed, and then it's going to process that print job and send it to the actual print device for printing. So this is the entire process. There's like 4 steps of getting from the client to the actual printer, sends it or makes a connection to the print server, sends the print job where it spools here, it converts the print job into a file that the printer understands, puts it in the queue will process it, and then it will send it out to be printed from the actual print device. Alright, from a common printing terminology perspective, I want you guys to be aware of certain things. So a print server is a regular Windows server, in this case, it could be, which holds queues for the different print devices. So instead of attaching printers directly to devices, you're attaching these printers to a print server, and all the spooling happens on the print server, and you're managing the queues on the print server, etc., etc. So it makes management of the actual print devices a little easier, especially if you're in enterprise. The printer device is the actual printer itself, the physical printer that outputs the paper. Now, when we say printer or printers, the terminology is referring to the logical representation of a printer within Windows. So it's like the printer icon within Windows. That's what's referred to as a printer or printers. So it's important here to understand the difference between printer device and printer or printers, because people commonly mistake those. Then you have the printer driver. That's obviously the piece of software that you install on Windows that gives the functionality and the features to that physical print device. So if you want to collate or any advanced features, the print driver will typically have those advanced features that you need. The print job is the data that is collected when the user clicks on print to print the screen. It's whatever is on the screen. All of that is sort of put into a print job, which is a data file or a packet, so to speak, and then that is transferred over to the print server for queuing and processing out to the printer device. The print queue is a holding area where if you have multiple jobs that you're submitting for printing to a print device, the print queue is what's going to organize them and say which one goes to the printer first. So it's just a holding area. The print spooler service that exists typically on every Windows machine, but it also exists on the print server. It is what sort of manages that print queue. It's that Windows service that takes care of how things are processed to that print device. And then you have the Citrix Print Manager service. That's sort of the relay between Citrix printing and Windows printing. That's what this particular print service takes care of. So these are just terminologies that I wanted you to be aware of that are important and that might be important for you on the CCA exam if you're going to sit on that particular exam. Types of printers and print job routings. Now, I told you when we introduced the lesson that there's a lot of different ways by which you can print using XenApp. So you can obviously use network attached printers to print. That's one way. You have a client that's connecting to a network server or a network attached printing, and you can print that way. You can also have something that's known as server local printers. So your XenApp server can have printers attached to it. So in essence, the XenApp server becomes sort of like a local print server, if you want, so that the users that are connecting to that XenApp server have direct access to the print server that's connected to it. So it could be connected via an Ethernet cable, it could be connected via LPT, whatever it's connected via, it's a local printer to that server, and users connecting to that server have direct access to it. Then you have client local printers. Client local printers is what we all have, for example, at home. You have your workstation at home that's connected, again, either wireless or it could be connected via an LPT port, whatever it's connected towards, but it's directly attached to your client device. And then you have client network printers. Client network printers is when, again, it's attached to your client, but it's attached via the network. So again, the difference between local printers is they're directly attached via a cable, and the network printers could be attached via Wi-Fi or wireless or TCP/IP, whatever the case might be. As long as there's network attached or connected, it becomes a client network printer. So again, from a representations perspective, a network attached printer, this is how it goes in a XenApp world, at least. You have your XenApp server here in the farm. One of the XenApp servers is connected to the network print server, and the network print server is what's connecting to the actual print device. So the routing of that particular print job goes from XenApp server to network print server, and network print server will send it to the print device for printing. Now, in the event of server local printers, you have your XenApp server here, one of the XenApp servers in the farm, that is directly connecting to the print device. So again, you're missing the network print server here, so this sort of becomes like the network print server in essence. And then you have locally attached client printers. Locally attached client printers are interesting because what's happening here is you have the client device, whether it's a laptop or a workstation, that is attached to the print device. Now, if you're a session on XenApp, what you're doing is you're sending the print job from the XenApp server to the client device, and the client device is then going to send it out to the actual print device. So you can see how it can become a little convoluted, a little problematic, especially if the XenApp server is in Chicago, for example, and the client device is in Las Vegas. That print job now has to travel that pipe. And keep in mind, when we said the ICA protocol is a thin protocol. However, as soon as you click on print, you're sending a significant amount of data across the wire. And you have to be able to handle that. Otherwise, the session here that's connecting to XenApp is going to have degradation, because what happens is the client device that's running here is going to issue the print command. It's going to spool the job or do whatever it needs to do with the job, send it back to the client device that's then going to send it out to the printing device. So we want to see if we can avoid this, maybe have an easier method by which we're transferring jobs to the printer device without having to cross all these WAN links if possible, and avoid the session degradation that would cause. Client network printers, again, depending on how policies are going to be configured, depending on how the printer is configured and connected, it could be a little cumbersome, right? So again, here it's a different scenario, but you have your client device that's logged into a XenApp server and that tries to print. Now, if the client is connected to a print server and the print server is connecting to the network, what happens here is as soon as this user logs onto the XenApp server is going to detect that this client has this particular network printer. It's going to make this network printer available to the user within the XenApp session. So when the user clicks on print, what happens is it's initiating from here. The print job is initiating from here. It's going to go back to the client device. The client device is going to send it all the way back up to the network printer, and the network print server is then going to send it to the actual physical print device. So you can see how it could quickly become a mess here if it's not configured properly, and we want to try to avoid some of these situations. However, in some other situations, this might be something that you want. This is something that might be wanted, and I'll give you an example. If you are giving access to users that are consultants, for example, and this consultant is connecting from his or her network, his or her domain, right? So think about it this way. The consultant, think of them in here. This is their domain. This is their network print server, and this is their print device, and this is NCOM, right? So this particular consultant is doing development work for NCOM. So you give them access to XenApp. Now this user is connecting to XenApp. XenApp's going to detect that, okay, well, this user has this printer. It's going to map it for them in their session. Now, if you were to make a direct connection between XenApp and the actual print device, it wouldn't work because the XenApp server is in a different domain. It doesn't have access rights to this printer or the print server, for that matter. So what happens in this case is when the user prints, it's going to send that print job back to the client, and the client is going to send it to the print server that he or she has access to, and that's going to come out and print. So again, like I said, there's different methods by which you can skin this cat, and depending on the circumstance and what you're trying to accomplish, you might want to use one approach versus another. All right, installing and replicating print drivers. Now, for those of you that have been using XenApp and Presentation Server for a while, you'll notice that with XenApp 6, the replication of print drivers has been taken out of the actual Delivery Services console and the Citrix Management console, so it's no longer in there. It's been moved into Windows. So what Citrix has done with XenApp 6, as if you've noticed during this whole course, is there's much more or tighter integration with Windows and Active Directory itself. So you'll see the Citrix policies are integrated. The printing functionality is very, very tightly integrated now with Windows. So what we're going to do is now to replicate printers, you'll have to leverage the PowerShell command script engine to use that comes with Windows 2008. Now, for those of you that don't know, Windows Server 2008 R2 will give you PowerShell by default, so there's nothing more that you can do. But what I wanted to do here is give you a link where you can download and install Microsoft PowerShell. If for whatever reason you want to install it on 2008, not R2 or earlier versions, I've provided a link that I find helpful. Now, in addition to PowerShell, what you want to do is download and install Citrix XenApp 6 software development kit, and I've given you the link where you can go get that. That's going to allow us to install and enable all the commandlets that Citrix gives us in order to augment PowerShell or leverage PowerShell to replicate print drivers and be able to talk directly to the Citrix backend engine that will allow us to do that. So those are very important. And the other thing is, well, now you'll notice that with the Delivery Services Console in XenApp 6, the printer's object is no longer there. It's been completely taken out of the Delivery Services Console. That's again because of the tighter integration that XenApp now has with Windows. So what you would have to do is add the role of print and document services within your XenApp server in order to leverage printing and be able to install drivers and later replicate them. So we're going to talk about that in just a second here. So installing and replicating the print drivers, again, you obviously have to install the print and document services role. I'll show you where you can do that. I'll show you how you can use the PowerShell to do driver replication. Now, I brought up this slide because I'll be doing a lot of copy and paste out of this particular slide when we do the replication, but I wanted to give it all to you in a sort of in a single location where you can pause the video at any point, and if you want to copy some of these commands, you could, just to follow along. And when we get into doing the actual process, I'll tell you exactly what each one of those commands does, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it now, but I just want you to know that I'll be doing a lot of copying and pasting from here, and I'll explain to you guys you know, how to construct this and replicate drivers. Now, printing policies. Now, when we were discussing Citrix policies in general, we skipped over the section for printing. Now we're going to come back and visit it in this lesson. But from a printing policies perspective, there are several policies that affect printing directly. From a printer provisioning perspective, the first thing we'll talk about is auto-created client printers, which means that as soon as the client establishes a session with XenApp, XenApp is going to detect what printers are locally attached to that client and make them available through the session. Now that'll only work if you have the auto-created client printers policy enabled. Then we're going to talk about session printers. Session printers is a way for you to augment what the user is getting from a printer's perspective. So they're automatically getting their auto-created client printers. But if you want to make available certain network printers for users in a certain area, you can add those via policy, and we'll talk about that as well. Then we're going to talk about printing directly to the network print server. What are some of the advantages? And I'll show you the policy where you can go and enable that so it's printing directly to the network print server and not having to go from XenApp, the client to network print server to the print device. And again, depending on the situation, you might want or not want that. Then we're going to talk about drivers. So all of this is great when it comes to printing, but we still have to handle drivers, right? So drivers are important. We're going to talk about driver mappings and why that's important. So when the user, sometimes the driver that's installed at the client level for a client operating system like Windows XP or Windows Vista or Windows 7, that driver name might be different than the same driver being installed on a server operating system like Windows 2008 or 2003. So what happens, in order for auto-created client printers to work, it has to have the same name of the driver that maps between the client and the server. And if that doesn't happen, the printer isn't going to map. So I'm going to talk about, well, how do we do driver mappings? Another use case for driver mappings is if you have a client device or a client printer that is an off-brand, or you bought it for free or you got it for free, and the driver isn't necessarily a great one and doesn't have an alternative for server class drivers, you probably want to map a different type of driver to this. So, the HP LaserJet 4 or the HP LaserJet 3 is a very generic print driver that works with almost any type of printer. So if you have, I don't know, maybe an Oki Data or some kind of a Dell printer that doesn't have the equivalent server operating system driver, you might be able to map an HP LaserJet 4 to it and it'll still print fine. Then we're going to talk about the universal print driver and its use cases. UPD is significantly helpful because of the driver mapping issues, because of incompatible drivers, because of stability that print drivers can introduce. The universal print driver gives you that baseline that you can use for across all printers. and it gives you enough functionality to get the job done. Now, it won't give you all the advanced features that are specific to that printer. If you want to give the users access to all of the advanced feature that that printer offers, then there's no way around the native printer. But if you wanted a way to standardize print drivers and make one print driver work across the different types of printers out there, the universal print driver is a fantastic solution. Then we're going to talk about limiting printer bandwidth. Again, like I said, the ICA client or the ICA protocol is a very thin protocol. However, as soon as you click on print, you take it from being very thin to being very, very cumbersome and huge, and you're sending an immense amount of data across that wire. So what we want to do is, in order to make sure that the session doesn't, the user doesn't see session degradation, we want to limit how much bandwidth printing is allowed to consume. Now, that could be significant, especially when you're dealing with those WAN locations, and I'll show you how you can do that with printing policies as well. And finally, we're going to wrap up the lesson by talking about mobile users and printing. We live in a mobile world, and we've been saying that throughout this course. What do you do with those users that have iPads and iPhones and netbooks and Zoom devices and all sorts of nets and eyes and whatever that are roaming across the campus that want to be able to print? However, they don't want to necessarily be able to print to the printer that's configured via the login script that you're giving them or anything like that, because that printer might be very, very far. How do you do it so that users can print to a printer that's closer to them? Well, we're going to talk about how you can do that, and you can very easily configure that. So based on the client IP address that the device has at the time, we can present printers that are in that area. That's called proximity printing, where, especially if you have the network set up properly, and this is essential for this to work. Let's say you have 5 floors in the environment, right? And each floor has its own subnet. If the user is on the 5th floor and they have an IP address from a DHCP server on the 5th floor, what's going to happen in that case, it's going to map printers that are on the 5th floor so they can print to them, etc., etc. This is again dependent on how well the network is properly configured and segmented. Another way of doing this is called smooth roaming or workspace control. So with smooth roaming and workspace control, one of its features is the ability for you, if you're working on a device on the 1st floor, it's a desktop, it's not a movable device, for example, and you decide, I need to go up to the 5th floor because I have a meeting, you can sort of disconnect from the session. Now, when you disconnect from the session is still running on the server. Keep that in mind. And you go up to the 5th floor, and then you reconnect to that same session on the 5th floor. Now it will map the printers that are on the 5th floor for you, and then you can print from that same session, so you don't have to completely log off and log back in for those printers to get remapped. So a lot of cool stuff here. We're going to discuss all of that and how you can configure these cool settings. So let's get right to it. Alright, so the first thing I want to show you first is, you'll notice, again, for those of you that have been using XenApp and Presentation Server for a while, that the printers node in the Delivery Services console has been completely removed. So again, Citrix is offloading a lot of these tasks onto Windows and integrating them very closely with Windows. So the first thing we want to do is install the printer management role, so to speak. So to do that, we're going to launch Server Manager, and under Roles, we're going to click on Add Roles. We're going to click on Next, go through the wizard, and then we're going to select the role for Print and Document Services. Next, we're just going to go with all the defaults. All we care about right now is a print server, so that's what we want to select and install. It's very simple, very easy and straightforward. Once this is completed in a second here, then what we can do is go through administrative tools and go through the print management console and be able to install drivers and then take a look at how we're going to replicate them. Now, while this is busy completing, let me show you where you can get access to the PowerShell. So on every Windows Server 2008 R2 box, you have access to PowerShell right away. You don't have to do anything in specific or in particular. So if you click on Windows PowerShell modules here, it'll bring up the PowerShell scripting engine, and you can start initiating commands. Now, I've also downloaded and installed the Citrix SDK, XenApp 6.0 X SDK, and I showed you the location where you can install or download and install that. It's a very basic, very straightforward installation. There's really nothing to see there. So download it and install it if you want to follow along there. Now, this is completed. The installation here is completed. So we're just going to click on Close, and then we're going to get out of Server Manager. And now let's go ahead and launch the Print Server Management. and you'll see that I now have access to that console. Let's go ahead and maximize that real quick. And then I want to drill down to print servers, XA01. And you'll see now I have access to printers. So again, during the presentation when we were talking about printers, when you click on printers, this is a logical representation of all the print devices that you have. These aren't actually print devices. This is just an object within Windows. So it's important to make a distinction here. So those are the printers that are currently installed on this particular print server, and these are the drivers that are currently installed on a particular print server. Now, if you wanted to install a driver, it's very easy, right? So you right-click on it and click on Add Driver here. You go through Next, go through the wizard, whatever it is. In our case, it's an X64. It's automatically selected. We're going to click on Next, and let's say you wanted to add, I don't know, let's go ahead and add HP, and let's find a good HP LaserJet printer. And let's go with the HP LaserJet 4100 series, for example. If we click on Finish here, now it'll go ahead and install that printer driver on this print server. Now this is easy enough, right? Now if you have a small environment, 2, 3 XenApp servers, it's not a big deal. You can do this manual process on them, 2 or 3 times, not the end of the world, right? And if you have a lot of print drivers, you can still kind of get away with doing it manually. However, in environments where you have hundreds, maybe thousands of XenApp servers, I don't think you want to be spending days, weeks going around basically each XenApp server installing a print driver on each one of them. And again, to reiterate why we need to install print drivers, depending on the device that's connected to the client, when that client logs onto a XenApp server, XenApp has to have a compatible driver for that print device in order for the printer to be made available within the session so that the user can print to it. That's why we need to install these drivers on XenApp. Now, that being said, you'll notice also that with XenApp 6, replication has been completely moved outside of a GUI. It's now completely off-shell or offloaded to PowerShell. So in order for you to replicate drivers from one XenApp server to another, you have to initiate a PowerShell script, which I showed you the syntax during the demo purposes. So what we're going to do now is bring up PowerShell, register the Citrix commandlets within PowerShell, and start initiating our replication commands. All right, let's go ahead and minimize this and bring up PowerShell Administrative Tools, Windows PowerShell Modules. Let's center this a little bit. Now, the first thing we want to do here is we want to enable the execution of remote signed script so that we don't get this error message, and we have to put the allow the server to accept PowerShell commands, so to speak. So we want to be able to enable that particular execution policy. Now, in order to do that, there are 2 commands you can do, right? So I'm going to again copy and paste some commands here, but the first one we want to do is do a get execution policy so that we know what the state of the execution policy is right now. And I'm going to just show you this just so that you can, in your environment, right now it's set to restricted. So what we want to do is enable it. So again, I'm going to grab another command here. Now what this command basically does, set execution policy remote sign, this will allow us to enable the policy so that we can execute commands within. So these are things that you have to make sure you have before you can even start initiating any of these commands. Now once these are in, the other command that we want to do is add all the Citrix commandlets, so to speak, into PowerShell so that we can initiate some of these commands. So what I'm doing here again is we're executing add ps-snap in citrix.all basically so that we get all of these commandlets in there. Now what I'm getting here is just an error that basically says, look, you already have those, so you don't need to add the citrix.all, they're already added. So we're just going to completely ignore this error message for now since we've already done this. I just wanted to show you how you would go about and the right steps to go about doing this. Now the first thing you want to do before you can start replicating the print drivers is you want a list of the print drivers that are available on this particular server. Now in the print management console here, we saw that we know all the print drivers that are available, but if you wanted an easy way to see those drivers within your PowerShell here, if you wanted to construct that particular driver inside of your script, you can initiate the following command. Now here's what I'm doing here. I'm doing get XenApp print drivers, and then I'm specifying which server I want to get the drivers from. Now I'm pointing it to XA01. You can point to any XenApp server in your farm and get a list of the drivers that are available on that particular server. So if I hit enter here, what it's going to do is it's going to show us a list of all of the drivers that are available on this particular server. Now the driver that we installed here was HP LaserJet 4100 series PCL6, and I know that this particular driver doesn't exist on XA02. So if we wanted to replicate this driver, we're going to use the following command. Now what I'm doing with this driver, it starts with start-xa printer driver replication dash driver name, and we put into quotes here the exact name of the driver that we have that we got out of the list up here, and then we're saying source server for this particular driver is XA01, so we know that it's installed on XA01, and I want you to replicate it to the target server XA02. Now if I click on enter here, it'll take a few seconds, but it'll actually go ahead and replicate that particular print driver to XA02. Now in order for us to figure out if this driver actually made it to XA02, what we're going to run is the following command: get XenApp print driver dash server name XA02. And voila, it took a second there. I had to run the command a second time, but you'll see that HP LaserJet 4100 series PCL6 has now been replicated to XA02. Now there's another command that I want to show you here. If you wanted to get some help on the start or the replication process, what you can do is run the following command, which gets help basically on this particular command. And let's do this. If I run the following command, get help on start XA printer driver replication, if we do this, you'll see that it gives you basically some help and some examples on what you can do and what you can run. Now here's the trick. Now once you've replicated the first driver, you don't want to have to do this constantly to every server that gets added to the farm. While you can, this is a script and you can add it in a normal script and just run it, it'll go out and replicate. You don't want to constantly update the script and edit the driver name, and it's just too much of a hassle. If there's an easier automated way of having sort of like a master list that automatically replicates every time a new server gets added to the farm, we want to do that. And that's specifically what we want to do. So the command that I'm going to show you next allows you to create that master list that you can basically add the driver to a master list that gets replicated every time there's a new XenApp server added to the farm. And that command is add xa auto replicate printer driver, and the driver name, you're sourcing it from XA01. So at this point, if I hit on enter, what's going to happen is it just added this particular HP LaserJet 4100 series PCL6 driver from this particular server has now been added into the auto-replicated driver list, so that every time there's a new server, it'll automatically replicate. Now, consequently, if you wanted to remove a particular driver from the auto-add or the auto-replicate list, you can do that very easily by just adding the remove, basically, syntax, if I can call it here, and the command will look something like this: remove xa blah blah blah, and you have the HP LaserJet 4100 driver here, and it'll automatically remove it from the auto replicate list. Now we don't want to do that, so I'm going to actually just remove this. And that's all there is to it from PowerShell. PowerShell is very powerful. It gives you access to do a lot of things that used to be maybe manual. You can script them, and as you can see, the scripting engine isn't that difficult to figure out or be able to replicate these drivers with it. So go ahead and build your scripts, add most of them to the auto-replicated list so that you can make your lives just a little easier. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to exit out of PowerShell and also get out of Print Management Console. Let's go back into our Delivery Services console, and let's take a look at the policies that we skipped as it regards to printing. So what we're going to do is click on Policies here, and what we're going to do is go ahead and edit the unfiltered policy. This is, by the way, this is under the user policies where we're doing all of this. So if you click on Edit here and click on Next, and we're going to drag down to Printers. We're going to select on Printing. The first thing we want to do is Client Printer Redirection. This is what we want to enable. Now, We've been talking about how with Citrix you have the ability of automatically creating the printers that are connected to your device and making them available through the session. Now this is the policy that would allow you to enable that particular feature or disable it. So if you have it allowed here, then those client printers are going to automatically be created within the session. If you have it disabled, or you're prohibiting that, and you might want to do that depending on the sensitivity of the application, you might not want to allow users to be able to print. So in some cases this might need to be disabled, but for now we're going to keep this enabled. So we're enabling that feature that allows us to do this, and then we're tweaking it a little more. So what do you want to auto create at this point? Do you want to auto create only the default printer? If you want to do that, you have a drop down box here that says, okay, I want you to automatically create the user's default printer or not. So again, it depends on what you're trying to do. You can set the default printer so that it is the client's main printer. So whatever the client's default printer is, once it maps it in the session, that also becomes the client's printer. You can set that up as well. We're going to click on OK to keep that. And then you have printer auto creation event logging. If you want to add it to the event log, you can feel free to again enable that particular policy, and you have a set of options here on what you're logging, etc., etc. The session printing is what we've been talking about, where if you wanted to add an extra layer of printers, right? So the users are going to get all of the printers that they have as part of their whatever's installed on their devices. But in some instances, you might want to add network printers for the clients that they don't necessarily have access to, but you want to give them access to. So you can click on Add here. You can come back in here and click on Add. For example, if the particular printer that you're looking for is on your domain, which is the case in with me, you can click whack.encom.local or your domain. Click on Browse here, and if you're browsing the directory, if you find a printer that you like that's in the directory, you can select it, you click OK, and that particular printer will be made available to the users based on who you're filtering this policy to. Now, if authentication is needed, you can always select prompt for network authentication credentials here. If you're logged in with a user that doesn't necessarily have the ability to browse the network for any particular printers, you can prompt for authentication, add in a different set of credentials which give you access to browse the domain and find these printers. So if you find that necessary, you can do that. Once you find the printer you want, you can click on OK here, and it will add that particular printer in the list, and then you can configure some of its settings, remove, add, whatever you want to do. But this is where you can add printers into the session that are not being auto-created. So they're not coming from the client device. You're just making them available through policies. So let's go ahead and click on cancel here and take a look at wait for printers to be created on the desktop. This one's interesting, and depending on who you're talking to, some people like it, some people don't like it. Now, so here's the trick. When users connect through a session, what you're basically saying here is, I don't want you to construct the session. I don't want you to give the user access to a session. So there are start menu to the desktop, nothing, until the printer objects have all been constructed in the background. Now, if you enable this in most cases will have a negative effect on users, because typically the user isn't going to log in and start printing right away. Now, in some cases you might want to. In some cases maybe your manager comes up and you need to print something and you're logging in specifically to print. So it might be an inconvenience where you log in, you don't see the printers because the printers are still being constructed or created in the background. So what happens is you'll have to wait a few seconds for all the printers to become available. However, you get immediate access to the session. So for most people, for 90% of the people, this might be a good thing to disable, because you want the users to get quick access to the session. You want them to be able to start becoming productive as quickly as possible, because odds are they're not going to print right away, right? So you can have them get access to the application or the desktop and continue to create those printers in the background, and a few seconds later those printers will be available to them, but at least you're not delaying the user until they get access to the particular resource that they're trying to get access to. So again, depending on the circumstance, depending on the users, you might have this disabled or enabled. In most cases, this will probably be disabled because it improves the user experience and gives quicker access to the session. So I'm going to keep that one disabled, and then we're going to move on to client printers here. Now, under client printers, auto create client printers. If we click on add here, well, what type of client client printers do you want to auto create, right? So you have the ability to not create any auto created printers. You don't want to map anything that's coming from the users. You want to auto create the client's default printer only. So if the user has 5 printers installed, you're only auto creating the default printer for that particular user. You might also want to auto create local non-network client printers. So what happens there is you're giving the user access to their local printers, but you're not giving the user access to their network printers from the device. So if the user has network printers and local printers, what's going to happen is when they log on to the session, those local printers and the network printers are going to automatically be presented in the session. And if the network printers are also being given to the user through the session policy, for example, now there's way too many printers that are made available through that session. And depending on which printer the user selects, it affects how the print job is routed. Let me give you an example. If you're mapping the network printer that is associated at the client device, if you're mapping that in the session and you click on print, the print job is going to spool on the XenApp server. It's going to be sent down to the client device. The client device is then going to send it to the network printer server, and the network print server is going to send it to that network printer. So you'll see here it's not a very efficient way of doing it. The only time you would want to use something like this is if the users are connecting from a different domain where you don't have access to the network print server or you don't have access to that printer. This might be useful. But if you're talking about your own organization, you might not want to do that, and you might want to give them direct access to the printer so that the XenApp server communicates directly to the network printer or to the network print server and bypasses that particular hop. Now again, depending on where the user is and if there's a network print server local to the user, depending on the circumstances, you might want to have this enabled or disabled, but I want you to be very aware of it because this can have significant effect on how printing is handled. Now you can also auto create all client printers if you wanted to, so let's go ahead and do that for this particular example. Click on OK. Client printer names, this one for the most part it's always going to be standard unless you're using with you're dealing with some legacy printer names and maybe MetaFrame XP or some older version of MetaFrame or very old printers. You might want to enable legacy printer names, but for the most part standard names are going to be just fine. Direct connections to print server. Now, again, this is what we've been talking about on how you want to route those particular print jobs. And again, you're going to have to make sure you're tweaking that correctly. But if you have a XenApp server and a network print server, they're on the same LAN, what you're doing is you're directing the network traffic directly to the print server, not having to send it back to the client and the client sending it to the network print server. That whole scenario that we talked about. So again, this might have a good effect, a positive effect, or a negative effect. For the most part, this should be enabled unless there are specific instances, a specific scenario where this is disabled, then you would select that. So I'm going to keep this enabled for now. The printer property retention policy here, what this allows you to do is where do you want to save the printer properties, the settings that the user makes for that particular printer. Do you want to save it in the profile if you're using some kind of a roaming profile, or do you want to save it on the actual device, the user's device itself, or do you not want to retain it at all? In most cases, the ideal place to save this would be to retain it in the user's profile. Now you can also save it if it's not if it can't be held in the user's profile, or if you can hold it on the user's device, then do that. Otherwise, hold it in the user profile. That's one approach. Typically, the ideal thing is to save it in the client profile so that it roams with the user wherever the user goes and connects. That those settings are following and they're readily available. You don't necessarily want to keep it on the client device just in case the user changes devices and those settings would be gone. So again, depending on the circumstance, you'll choose the setting that's appropriate, but I wanted to make you aware of the different options that you have access. So for now, we're just going to keep it in the user's profile. Now, retained and restored client printers. What allows you to do here is if a user creates a particular printer using the configuration tool or anything else, do you want that particular printer that the user created or made available to them to be retained so that it's automatically restored the next time the user is connecting? These are settings that, again, based on the set of circumstance and based on the situation, you might want to allow or disallow. For now, I'm just going to keep it allowed. It doesn't hurt to retain those particular settings and avoid that help desk call per se. And then we move on to drivers here. Drivers are interesting. So automatic installation of inbox print drivers. If we click on add, what you're allowing or enabling here to do is, do you want to allow print drivers to automatically be installed on the XenApp server if they're not there? So let's say a user is connecting from a device, and that particular device has an HP LaserJet 4100 on there, but the HP LaserJet 4100 driver isn't installed on the XenApp server. If you enable this policy, then as soon as the detection happens that, okay, well, I understand that this device needs an HP LaserJet 4100, I'm going to automatically install it, and you're giving the session the right to automatically install that particular driver. This could be dangerous because you don't want print drivers to automatically be installed. You want to be able to control what drivers are being installed on the server. But in the event that the device doesn't find an appropriate driver, then that mapping doesn't happen. So here you have to weigh in, well, how many help desk calls am I going to get? Is this worth the headache or not? In my opinion, it's definitely worth the headache. So you probably want to have disabled this, and you want to manually control which drivers are being installed on that particular XenApp server for safety reasons especially. Now, again, drivers used to be a very sensitive conversation because drivers used to crash XenApp servers and MetaFrame servers years and years ago, especially those drivers that are not signed drivers or not drivers that are built for a multi-user environment. Drivers have become much better, especially with Windows Server 2008 R2. So the likelihood of that happening is low, but I would still feel more comfortable knowing what is being installed on that server rather than having those drivers getting installed without my knowledge as an administrator. So my recommendation is to have this disabled unless there's a reason for it to be enabled, and there might be in some instances. Now again, printer driver mapping and compatibility. You might want to map a particular driver on the server that is not necessarily the same driver that's installed at the client, but you know that this driver will work with this printer, and it's a more stable driver from a server operating system perspective. Now, as we mentioned before, in order for the auto creation to happen, the client driver name that's installed on the client workstation and the driver name that's installed on the XenApp server have to match. It cannot be different names, otherwise the mapping doesn't happen. And depending on the manufacturer of the printer and the manufacturer of the driver, those printers might be different for client operating systems than they are for server operating systems. Now granted, this has been improved over the years. Years ago, this was horrible because they would be completely different. Today, in most cases, they're the same, they're identical. So you can map the exact same, or you don't need to do mappings for those particular drive names. But drive mappings come into effect if you're trying to map a different driver than the one that's installed on the client. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you buy an off-brand printer, an Encom printer. One of them exists in the world, and you can't find a suitable driver to install on XenApp. So what you do is you take sort of like an HP LaserJet 4 driver. You take a driver that you know is generic. It'll work with almost any type of printer, and you're comfortable with that driver. You take that driver and you map it to the Encom driver that came with your printer, and now when the Encom printer is trying to connect through the session, it's going to be mapped to an HP LaserJet 4, and when it goes to print, you're going to use that driver to render the packet or render the data file that you sent to the printer for printing. That could be very helpful and very useful. So let's say the Encom driver is called Encom driver. What you can do is say, all right, if you see this particular driver coming from the client, I do not want you to create it. You can allow it, of course, but you can also say, I don't want to create it. This printer doesn't work. We've tried it. You don't want to deal with it. You do not create when it detects this. You can also say, I want you to create it with a universal print driver. This is an excellent option when you're trying to map these printer drivers that can be cumbersome or can be a hassle to deal with. You probably want to create them with a universal print driver. Now, in the odd instance where you want to specify a print driver for the mapping, you can also do replace with, and then you can find a particular print driver that you want off of your XenApp server. And let's say we want to go with let's go with the HP LaserJet 4100 that we added here. Click on OK. If we click on OK, now you've just created a mapping between NCOM driver, which is replaced by HP LaserJet 4100 when this particular driver is detected. So this is, again, a way for you to map these printer drivers so that you're providing the best user experience possible for your users. And now we get to universal printing. The universal printer, like I said, is a very generic, very standardized print driver. So think of it as the HP LaserJet 4. That driver would work with almost anything and any printer. So think of the universal printer as that type of driver. It won't give you all of the features, all of the bells and whistles that come with the native print drivers for that particular print device, but in most cases it's good enough for all of the users to get about getting their print jobs, getting the functionality they need out of it. So what we're doing here is auto create generic universal printer. So if we click on add, here you're enabling it or disabling it. So let's say we want to enable this. We're going to click on OK. And then what you're doing is universal driver priority. So let's click on add and take a look at what that means. So depending on the type of print job that's being submitted, you might want to use the universal print driver, or you might not want to use the print driver, right? So if you detect that it's an EMF print job that's being created, this is the job in its rawest format, you might not want to use the universal print driver to process these types of print jobs, right? So if you click on edit here, you can accept it, change the format, you can add another one, you can click on new and add a new type of format for this particular file. So what you're saying here is, all right, well, what do you want to use the universal print driver for? And you're selecting these values and they're prioritized. So if it's EMF, then it's going to go with a print driver. It's XPS, it's this is the priority list, and you can move it up or down based on how you're prioritizing the type of print file that you want to print. For the most part, you leave this at default. You don't have to move it or change it or anything like that. But if you feel that there's a need to prioritize them, and maybe you want the PCL4 to be higher than EMF, etc., then this is where you can come in and make those changes. Now we go into universal printing, and what you're doing here is saying, all right, well, when do you want to use the universal printer driver, right? You want to use universal print driver only if the requested driver is unavailable. So the user is connecting, that session is being created, and all of a sudden there's a printer that doesn't have its equivalent on the print server or on the XenApp server. What do you want to do? You want to try to install it automatically. If you have a drive mapping or a driver mapping, great. But what happens if none of the above exists? Well, in that case, use universal print driver only if the requested native driver isn't available. So in that case, you get the universal print driver, and you have the option here of use only printer model specific drivers, which means you're always using the native print drivers. You're not using the universal print driver at all. You can only use the universal print driver if you want to. Again, use universal print driver if the native driver isn't there, or use printer model specific drivers only if the universal print driver isn't available. So in my implementations of XenApp, honestly, this is the option that we usually select. We want to use the universal print driver. In the event that the universal print driver is unavailable, then fall back or fail back to using the native driver that you have installed on the XenApp server. Again, the universal print driver, for the most part, is more than enough to get around all the printer requirements that the user is going to need. Now you have the universal printing preview preferences, which you can enable or disable. They'll be up to you, and you have several options here to control if you want to enable or disable previewing of print jobs that are using the universal print driver. Now, this is all there is to it from a printing policies perspective. The only other thing that I wanted to show you was how you can manage the bandwidth of printing when it comes to printing through ICA. So again, as we've been saying all along, ICA is a very thin protocol. It usually deals very good with graphics, and it's very optimized for mouse clicks and keyboards, etc. across a WAN. But as soon as you hit that print button, all of a sudden all the thinness out of the ICA is taken out, and the ICA has all of a sudden a lot of data to deal with. So there's got to be a way for you to limit how much printing consumes out of this bandwidth, so that the session that doesn't degrade too much and the user doesn't lose that user experience per se. So what you want to do is limit the bandwidth that printing is allowed to use. So what you want to do here is you have two policies you can deal with: printer redirection bandwidth limit. If you click on add here, you can control that in kilobits per second. And this is where you set the maximum allowed bandwidth for a session, how much you're allowed to consume as far as bandwidth is concerned in kilobits per second. Don't set this too low, because if you set this too low and a user tries to go and print and there's not enough bandwidth to process that particular print job, it'll take hours, and then you're going to get a different type of call because they can't print fast enough. So again, this is going to depend on your testing, and you need to come to a value here that makes sense in your environment, that gives them an adequate experience when they click on print, but doesn't consume all the bandwidth that's available where the session degrades and kind of defeats the purpose. So set it accordingly, and this will probably take some testing here to do. The other option that you can do is printer redirection bandwidth with limit %, right? So instead of setting an actual value in kilobits per second, what you're doing here is you're setting it from a percentage standpoint. You can do 10% of the bandwidth that's available, or 5% of the bandwidth that's available, so on and so forth. And that's all there is to it, really, from Citrix policies as far as printing is concerned. Now, what I want to talk about a little bit here is what we talked about in the presentation, which is proximity printing. I mentioned that, for those mobile users that are roaming across the campus, you want to be able to give them access to printers depending on where they are, and specifically, you can filter it to give them a different printer based on where they're connecting from, like the IP address that they have on their device, if your network is segmented properly. Now, to do that, I'm just going to show you real quick here that we talked about when we were in printing. We talked about session printers. So let's say you wanted to configure proximity printing for those laptop users based on a subnet, a particular subnet. So what you would do here is, you'll add the printers that you know are going to be part of subnet 192.168.1.0 through 255. So you'll add those printers. Now, when you're done and you save this particular policy, what you want to do here is you want to filter the policy based on that client IP address range. Now, we can't do this to the unfiltered policy, so let me just show you real quick. If you create a policy here, let's say you want to call this policy 192.168.1. Let's say X printing, or print policy. And we click on next. You go through all the printer configurations that you want. Once you're done, we want to filter this based on client IP address, right? So if I click on add here and we click on it here, you're allowing it and you're giving it an IP range per se. Let's say anyone coming in from 192.168.1.star. So that allows it. You can also do it by doing 192.168.1.0 through 192.168.1.255. Now you can click on OK. Now the other thing that you can do in here is if you click on add, if you wanted to filter out certain clients so that they don't get that particular printer, you can also set it to deny and then set the same ranges if you wanted to do it. So you can get very granular with what you're doing from a policies perspective and who you're applying this to. But if we're applying this to anyone coming into the 192.168, and if you configure that policy, you click on OK, click on next here, you're enabling the policy. Click on save, bada bing bada boom. Now you're creating more policies, and you can create different policies for the different subnets or the different geographical locations, so that when a user is connecting from that particular location, they're getting a different type of printer that you're delivering via session printing. Now the other thing that I mentioned that we talked about is workspace control or smooth roaming. Now that's configured via web interface, and we talked about that in the web interface lesson. I'm just going to refresh your memory real quick. If you click on start here, if we go to all programs under Citrix and under management, we're going to launch the Citrix web interface management console. On your site, if you right click on it, drag down to workspace control. This is where you can configure the workspace control settings, and one of the things that you want to be able to do is enable the reconnection button. Obviously, you want to be able to reconnect, etc., etc. So you can configure workspace control here as well, so that when users are disconnecting from a particular device, you don't disconnect the session, and they can pick up the session on another device, and you can, it'll have all their printers automatically reconfigured for them at that point. So I just want to refresh your memory here on where that was. Now the last thing I want to talk about in this lesson is how you can give access to your users to the ICA print configuration tool, which allows them to have a little more control when they're inside of their ICA session if they want to connect to certain other printers that maybe aren't available, and they don't necessarily have to call the help desk to do that. So under applications, you should publish that to all of your users. And just to show you where that is, if you go on all programs here and you go under Citrix, under administration, you'll see that you have access to the ICA client printer configuration tool. Now this tool will only run when you're inside of an ICA session. So if you try to run this on the console or within RDP, it won't launch. So you want to make sure you publish it and give your users easier access to it. Now I know some of you will probably freak out and say, I don't want to give them access to this type of an application. But if you take a step back and think about what you're really giving them access to, all they can do with this tool is add another printer. It's the same thing as if they were on their local desktop and trying to connect to a printer. It's the same process, except you're giving them that ability from within an ICA session. So I strongly recommend it. Now to do that, we're going to right-click, Publish Application. It's just a normal way to publish an application. It's installed locally on this particular XenApp server, so we can use that. So I'm just going to call it ICA Printer Configuration Tool. And we click on Next. It's installed anyway, so we're just going to go Defaults. Now, its location is under C Program Files x86 in the Citrix folder, under System 32. And we're going to scroll all the way down here. And there it is. It's printcfg.exe. So once you select it, you can just go through Next all the way and just publish that to your users. We've done this 100 times, so you guys have seen the process. But I just wanted to show you where you would go to make this particular tool available and what it's used for. So again, I strongly recommend you make this tool available, make your users aware that such a tool exists so that they know that when they're within their ICA session, they can use this tool to grab printers that might not necessarily be available to them otherwise. And that's all there is to it from a printing perspective. So let's go ahead and switch back to our presentation and recap what we've learned. I was just thinking, after this entire lesson, you guys have it easy. You guys are spoiled, really. I used to remember when we used to pull our hair just trying to get printing to work, and this is back when it was WinFrame and MetaFrame and MetaFrame XP and all that. Dude, it's so elegant. It's so nice with XenApp 6 now. It's so easy, and you look at it and you're like, oh, this is not too bad. After I take a step back and I'm like, I gave all that, that opening statement about printing, and now I'm looking back and it's not that bad. These guys have it easy. So what did we cover in this lesson? We talked about how Windows handles printing, how it moves from the client device to the print server to the print device itself, and how the job is routed, and etc., etc. We talked about common printing terminology, like the actual printer means the logical representation of the physical printer within Windows. It's the icon, basically. We talked about print queues and print jobs and print devices, etc. We then moved on to talk about the different types of printers and print job routing. We talked about network attached printers, server local printers, client local printers, client network printers, etc., etc. We moved on and talked about the installation and replication of print drivers, and we mentioned that with XenApp 6 you no longer can replicate through the GUI, and that the printers node has been moved out of the GUI and it's not completely offloaded onto Windows, and you have to install the print and document services role within Windows Server 2008 in order to manage and install print drivers. And then I showed you how you use PowerShell to replicate those print drivers from one server to another. And then we talked about printing policies. We went back into the Citrix policies and discussed the different types of policies that you have that relate to printing in particular. We talked about universal print drivers, the native print drivers. We talked about bandwidth limitations and how you can set that accordingly within the print driver policies or within the print policies themselves. We then talked about and published the ICA client printer configuration tool, printcfg.exe. And talked about how that is a useful tool for users to have access to, just in case they want to be able to map certain printers or do certain things within the session that they don't necessarily have to call the help desk, even though they will call the help desk anyway. But we talked about how you can publish that tool and make it available to them in the event that they know or can use it. And then we wrapped up by talking about mobile users and printing and what you can do and how you can configure proximity printing so that if users are on, at different locations within the campus, based on the IP address that they're connecting from, how they can get access to certain printers. We also talked about smooth roaming and workspace control, and how if the user disconnects from a particular session on device A, moves to another area of the building and uses device B to connect to that same session, how you can map the printers for that particular user from that new location. Finally, I hope this lesson was informative for you. There was a lot of information about printing, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.